My name is Liana. They say a heart valve repair is one of the most delicate surgeries a human can survive. But as I stood on my father's porch, barely 24 hours after they cut me open, the physical pain was nothing compared to the ice in Harold's eyes. My chest was bound in surgical tape. Every breath felt like a jagged knife, and the monitors from the ICU were still ringing in my ears. I reached for the door handle, needing a bed, a pillow, a single ounce of mercy. But my father, the man who was supposed to be my protector, didn't move. He stood behind the glass, his face a mask of cold disgust. "I don't support burdens, Liana," he said, his voice as flat as a grave. "Weakness is a choice, and I won't have it under my roof." Then, he did the unthinkable. He slid the deadbolt. Clack. That sound, the sound of my own father locking me out to die in the freezing rain while my heart struggled to beat, is a sound I will take to my final rest. He thought he was finishing me off. He thought a girl with a broken heart would just disappear. What he didn't know was that 5 years later, the burden he threw away would become the woman who owned the very medical facility he'd one day crawl to, begging for his life. This is the story of how my father tried to stop my heart, only for karma to give me a brand new life. But before the revenge, you need to see the moment my diagnosis turned into a death sentence. But as I sat there in the dark, gasping for air, I had no idea that my father's ultimate betrayal was actually the first step toward a fortune he would eventually beg me to share. I grew up in a house where love was something you earned, like a grade on a report card or a trophy on a shelf. My father, Harold, didn't believe in softness. In our home, a fever was seen as a lack of discipline, and a scraped knee was a reason for a lecture on being resilient, never a reason for a hug. He lived by a simple, cruel code. The world is divided into the strong who lead and the weak who are a drain on resources. He called it his burden philosophy. For 26 years, I killed myself trying to stay on the strong side of that line. I worked 2 jobs while finishing my degree. I never complained, and I became the daughter who anticipated every one of his needs before he even had to ask. I thought that if I was perfect enough, I would finally be worthy of the title, daughter. The first time I felt my heart skip, I was at work, carrying a heavy tray of documents. It felt like a tiny bird trapped in my chest, fluttering frantically against my ribs. I ignored it. I hid the shortness of breath behind quick sips of water. I masked the dizzy spells with forced smiles. I was terrified that if Harold saw me falter, I'd lose the tiny bit of respect I had worked my whole life to build. I spent months living in fear of my own body, treating my heart like a secret I had to keep from a judge. But hearts don't care about secrets. They eventually demand to be heard. The day I collapsed in the hallway of our home, Harold didn't rush to my side with worry. He stood over me, his arms crossed, looking down at me as if I were a spilled glass of milk that he now had to clean up. "Get up, Liana," he barked. "Stop being dramatic." I tried to speak, but the air wouldn't come. My vision was tunneling, and all I could see were his polished shoes, unmoving, cold, and distant. When the paramedics finally arrived, he didn't ride in the ambulance. He told them he had a meeting he couldn't miss, and that he'd meet us at the hospital later. The diagnosis was a death sentence delivered in a sterile room, a critical mitral valve prolapse. The doctor told me the valve was failing, and without major surgery, my heart would simply stop. I was terrified. I looked at Harold, hoping for a hand on my shoulder or a word of comfort. Instead, he sat in the corner of the room, scrolling through his phone. When the doctor explained that the recovery would be long and that I would need someone to care for me 24/7 for weeks, Harold finally looked up. He didn't look at me with love. He looked at me like I was a bill he didn't want to pay. "This is going to be quite an inconvenience," he muttered, mostly to himself. I told myself he was just stressed. I told myself that underneath that hard exterior, he was scared of losing me. I convinced myself that once I was out of surgery, once I was truly vulnerable, the fatherly instinct he'd buried for so long would finally surface. I spent the night before the operation praying, Not for the surgery to go well, but for Harold to finally see me. I thought this was our chance to be a real family. I thought my weakness would finally be the bridge to his heart. I was wrong. He watched the surgeon explain the risks like he was reading a grocery list. No fear in his eyes. Just calculation. I should have seen it then. The way he looked at me wasn't as a daughter, but as a faulty piece of equipment he was ready to discard. But the night before they wheeled me into the OR, Harold made a phone call that changed everything. I thought he was checking on my insurance, but he was actually clearing the way for a woman who was about to take my place before my stitches even dried. The ride home from the hospital felt like an eternity in a meat locker. I was slumped in the passenger seat, every vibration of the tires on the pavement sending a white-hot spark of agony through the fresh incision in my chest. My heart felt heavy, a strange metallic weight that didn't quite belong to me yet. I looked at Harold. He was gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, staring straight ahead, as if he were driving a stranger to a bus station, rather than his only daughter home from the brink of death. I tried to thank him for picking me up, but the words died in my throat. The air in the car was thick with a silence that felt like a physical threat. When we finally pulled into the driveway, my heart, the one the doctors had worked so hard to save, began to race with a sudden sickening dread. There, sitting on the porch under the dim yellow light, were 4 black industrial trash bags. I recognized the floral print of my favorite quilt peeking through the top of one. My breath caught, and the pain in my chest flared. "Dad? What is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Harold didn't even look at me. He put the car in park and stared at the garage door. "I told you, Liana. I don't support burdens. I watched you in that hospital bed, and I realized you've become exactly what I despise. You're a liability now. A drain. I've spent my life building a legacy of strength, and I won't have a sickly daughter dragging me down or expecting me to be her nurse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I just had surgery yesterday, Dad. I can't even lift a gallon of milk. Where am I supposed to go?" "That's for you to figure out. Maybe being on the street will finally teach you the resilience you've been faking all these years," he said, his voice devoid of any human emotion. He walked around the car, opened my door, and practically hauled me out. I nearly collapsed. I had to lean against the cold brick of the house just to stay upright, my hands clutching the bandages over my heart. He stepped onto the porch, walked inside, and I heard it, the heavy final thud of the deadbolt. Then the sky opened up. A cold, biting rain began to fall, soaking through my thin hospital hoodie. I sat on those bags, shivering so hard I thought my stitches would pop, gasping for air that felt too heavy to breathe. I was going to die right there on his porch, and he was probably inside pouring a glass of scotch. But then, through the blur of rain and tears, I saw headlights. A rusted, beat-up sedan pulled into the driveway, splashing through the puddles. It was Sophia. She didn't even turn off the engine before she was out of the car, running toward me with a scream of pure horror. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She just wrapped her arms around me, ignoring the blood seeping through my shirt, and whispered, "I've got you, Liana. You're never going back in there." Sophia didn't just give me a place to sleep that night. She gave me the secret to a comeback that would eventually leave Harold standing in the rain, begging for the very mercy he denied me. Recovery wasn't a straight line. It was a jagged uphill battle fought in a cramped one-bedroom apartment that smelled of Sophia's peppermint tea and the iron-scented reality of my own healing body. For the first 6 months, Sophia was my hands, my feet, and quite literally, my strength. She worked double shifts at the diner just to keep us in generic brand soup and pay for the mountain of heart medications that kept me alive. Every time a bill arrived from the hospital, I felt a fresh wave of panic. I was a burden, just like Harold said. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the hum of the city outside, feeling the scar on my chest throb with every beat, wondering if my father was right. Maybe I was just a broken thing taking up space. But Sophia wouldn't let me sink. Every morning she'd sit me up, help me walk 3 steps further than the day before, and whisper, "You aren't a burden, Liana. You're a miracle." And miracles don't quit. By the end of the first year, I could finally breathe without pain. I started working from the kitchen table, taking every freelance data entry job I could find. We saved every penny. We lived in the dark to save on electricity. We wore coats indoors during the winter. We were survivalists in a world that had tried to discard us. Then, 2 years into my recovery, the impossible happened. A heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $1 million. I thought it was a prank. I thought Harold was playing a sick game to get my hopes up before crushing them again. But there was a note, written in elegant, shaky handwriting, for the heart he tried to break, build something he can never touch. I spent weeks trying to trace the money, but the trail was cold. I decided to stop looking for the why and started focusing on the what. And I took that money and invested it with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed. I didn't want a mansion or a sports car. I wanted a fortress. I went back to school for healthcare administration, and together with Sophia, we founded the Heart Center. It started as a small outpatient clinic, but it grew into the most advanced cardiac facility in the state. I made sure we never turned away a patient based on their utility or their bank account. I built a place where burdens were treated like royalty. It was only last year that I finally learned the truth about the money. I received a frantic, tearful email from a woman named Vanessa. I recognized the name immediately. She was the young, beautiful replacement Harold had moved into the house the very week he kicked me out. She told me that she had been there that night. She had watched through the window as I sat in the rain on those trash bags. Harold had laughed while he poured them both a glass of expensive wine, bragging about how he'd finally trimmed the dead weight from his life. Vanessa told me she couldn't sleep for years. She realized that if he could do that to his own flesh and blood, he would eventually do it to her. So, she waited. She played the part of the doting wife until she gained full access to his accounts. Then, she systematically drained him. She took his savings, his investments, and even the deed to the house he loved more than me. She was the one who sent the $1 million. She told me she did it because she wanted to see Harold's greatest failure become his greatest superior. She left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a pile of debt, vanishing into the night just as he had forced me to do. Now, 5 years after that night on the porch, I am no longer the girl gasping for air in the rain. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar medical empire. I have a heart of steel, a bank account that Harold could only dream of, and a staff of hundreds who call me boss. But as I looked at the security footage this morning, my blood went cold. A man was standing at the clinic's entrance, shivering and clutching a tattered coat to his chest. He looked like a ghost, but I recognized those cold, arrogant eyes anywhere. Harold was back, and he had no idea that the burden he discarded was now the only person on earth who could save him. I watched him on the high-definition security monitor for what felt like an eternity. The man who once looked like an indestructible giant in my childhood was now a shriveled, trembling shell of a human being. He was standing in the lobby of the Heart Center, clutching a tattered coat that looked like it had been pulled from a dumpster. His hair was thin and white, and his hands, those hands that had once slammed the door on my dying body, were shaking so violently he could barely hold the intake form. He didn't know he was standing in my building. He didn't know that the burden he discarded was the one who signed the paychecks of every doctor in this facility. I walked out of my office, my heels clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble floors. Each step was a heartbeat, steady and strong, thanks to the surgery he tried to weaponize against me. When I entered the waiting room, the air seemed to vanish. Harold looked up, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the old authority in his eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by a wave of pure, agonizing shock. He turned pale, his jaw dropping as he took in my designer suit and the CEO badge pinned to my chest. "Liana?" he rasped, his voice cracking. Is that you?" "It's Dr. Liana now, Harold," I said, my voice as calm as a summer lake. "Though I'm surprised you're here. This facility is for people who value life. I thought you only valued strength." He collapsed into one of the plush waiting chairs, burying his face in his filthy hands. The story poured out of him like a flood, a pathetic, miserable tale of how Vanessa had played him for years. She hadn't just left him. She had systematically dismantled his life, piece by piece, as an act of penance for what she saw him do to me. He was in full financial ruin. He told me he was living in a shelter, and that his own heart was failing. He needed the same procedure I had 5 years ago, but no other hospital would take him without insurance or a massive down payment. He was begging for a favor, begging for the very life he once told me I didn't deserve. I leaned in close, so close he could see the absolute lack of pity in my eyes. "Do you remember the rain, Harold? Do you remember the sound of that deadbolt sliding into place while I was gasping for air on your porch? I was wrong, Liana. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking—" "No," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut like a scalpel. "You were thinking perfectly. You were following your burden philosophy. You told me that weakness was a choice, and that you wouldn't support a drain on your resources. Well, look at you now. You're broke, you're sick, and you're standing in my lobby asking for a handout. By your own definition, you are the ultimate burden." He started to sob, a sound so hollow it didn't even stir a grain of sympathy in my soul. I signaled to Sophia, who was standing by the nurse's station with a look of grim satisfaction. I told the staff to process him as a charity case. I wouldn't let him die, not because I loved him, but because I wanted him to live every single day knowing that his life was a gift from the daughter he tried to kill. I wanted him to walk these halls and see my name on every door, a constant reminder that his weak daughter was the strongest person he ever knew. Success wasn't just about the money Vanessa secretly sent me. It was about the moment I realized I didn't need his apology to be whole. I walked back to my office, feeling the steady, rhythmic thump in my chest. My heart was healthy, my spirit was free, and family karma had finally come full circle. Welcome to Prime Karma Stories, your home for the most satisfying tales of revenge and justice. We dive deep into family drama and life lessons that prove karma always finds its way. We explore the dark corners of family betrayal to find the light of satisfying resolutions. If you believe in justice and love a good karma story, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.